classifications or types of epithelial tissue. Previously, we talked about the functions of epithelial tissue. We talked about the characteristics of epithelial tissue. Now we're describing really the two ways in how we name them, but it's based off their structure. We name them two ways. First off, the layers of the cells. When we covered our characteristics, one of the things we talked about was polarity, that it had two distinct sides, a basal surface and an apical surface. How we describe that is the number of layers. So you see across the board here, this says all simple, and this says stratified. Simple means it's one layer of cells. Stratified means it's 2+ layers of cells. And what it means is what it's sitting on that basal surface. So when I look at this layer, underneath here is the basal surface, and then there's one layer of cells. One layer of cells, but when I go down here, this is 2+ layers of cells. And it's all based on the structure creates the function. Simple, one layer of cells makes it easier to move things across. Osmosis, diffusion, filtration. When I have stratified, typically it's more for protection. When we go back to our layers of the skin, then we learn the epidermis, that's stratified epithelial tissue because I need that protection because it's the windshield of my body. Then we describe it based on the shape of the cells. So squamous or squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. As we look at the shapes of the cells, squamous is referring to like scales. So when you think about the scales that come off of a fish, thin, flat cells are called squamous cells. So they're thin and flat for a reason. Thin and flat allows for the movement again of materials. When we look at the alveoli of the lungs, to be able to breathe in, I want to make sure that oxygen carbon dioxide exchange is very efficient. So I use squamous cells for that. As they get larger in size, now they become cuboidal. So cuboidal cells look like a cube or a square, and we get a little bit more room in that cell to allow for more activity. So typically we see cuboidal cells now are more active, and where we see them as areas of secretion. So they're secreting a product. So when we look at some of our sweat glands, they'll have cuboidal cells. When we look at the thyroid gland, it can have cuboidal cells. So they're secreting something. Versus squamous is allowing just for movement. When we get into columnar, when we look at a microscope slide, to me they tend to look like fingers because they're just longer like rectangles. So all of these are individual columnar cells. More room in the cell, which means more activity. We tend to see them where you have more complex chemical reactions like my digestive tract. Stomach, small intestine, large intestine is all simple columnar that lines those linings of the tubes because we're going through the process of metabolism and breaking down food. So we have columnar. Transitional means it can transition back and forth to have multiple types. It can be squamous, cuboidal, sometimes columnar, but a mix of the three shapes. What that allows me to do is movement. So when I have different sizes, it allows for things like stretching. So we typically use the example of the urinary bladder. As it fills up with urine, it's expanding. And the different types of cellular shapes allows for movement. So transitional is a mix of the three. So then we go stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, just 2+ layers of the cells. And then lastly, we'll describe pseudo-stratified and pseudo-false stratified. So they look like they're stratified. To me, the easiest way to think about this is like when you're looking downtown at buildings, they're all different sizes. So it looks like there's multiple layers, but they're all connected to the ground. And in this case, it's connected to that basal surface. So they may look like different sizes, but they are all connected to one side, the basal surface. So that's pseudostratified. The other thing we'll see is they have cilia. Cilia are these little spiky things running across the cell surface. Cilia allow for movement. When we look at microvilli, that's for absorption. Cilia allows for movement. Columnar cells, because they're more like columns. So pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, we tend to call that PSCC. Best example of that is we call this the respiratory epithelium. We've talked about different types of cells and tissue membranes. We talked about mucus that's produced by goblet cells. We have this in my trachea, the ability to bring up the stuff that I breathe so it doesn't harm my respiratory system, my lungs, and I can spit it out or I can swallow it. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is where I see this in the respiratory system primarily. So we have them described based on their number of layers, simple and stratified, and then the shape of their cells. The structure creates the function. Remember, this is unique specifically to epithelial tissue. Later, we'll talk about the makeup of connective, muscle, and nervous.